So the first one that I wanted to talk about is also probably the most important of all, and that is the quality of the story itself. So no matter how well can you do the star format or any other format, the quality of the story will be the most important indicator of the quality of your overall answer. For example, if they ask you, tell me about the time when you failed, and you say, oh yeah, sure, just yesterday I forgot to remember about some task that my manager gave me, however it was nothing serious and we quickly moved on. So this is the type of examples that actually ruin your show. So this is why you want to prepare quality stories that you would eventually then embed into a star format. The second item that I wanted to talk about here is simply spending too much time on the situation and or task. And actually, many interviews recommend you to use the SAR format, that is to compress the situation and task into one, simply because of this problematic start of an answer. Like, for example, if you'd ask me, tell me about the time when you failed, I could talk about a previous HR business that I had, into which we're supposed to deliver HR software to small to medium-sized businesses. And we had the full range of features such as employment application, telephone screening forms, multi-rater surveys, integrations with various job boards, and so on and so forth. However, the important part, the action part of the story, is that the software basically failed to attract an interesting mass of people, of clients, and ultimately to generate a steady amount of revenue. So this is one of the main reasons for which it failed within 5 years. And of course, I will start talking about the learnings and so on. But the main point here is that in this example, it doesn't make much sense to talk about the features of the software, because the software actually, the story is about tell me about the time when you failed, not to explain you when the features failed, but the software, the business failed. So try to focus on the elements that matter the most in your answer, knowing that in the beginning you'll be tempted to spend too much time on the situation and the task. The third mistake that people make while answering behavioral questions is to simply forget the results. And it's very common to forget the results, especially if you are focusing a lot on the action part of your story, and especially if you're explaining something that's complicated and something that you spend a lot of brain cycles focusing in. Now, one method to overcome this is to simply remember the STAR method, and to always not forget to talk about the results, because oftentimes the results are not the essential part of an answer. However, they are a very important part of the answer to make it a complete package here. So just remember each time you're getting asked a behavioral question to use the STAR format and to ensure that you fill in all the elements of this format. Number 4 here would be, in the case of failure stories, and notice here I'm talking a lot about failure stories because they are a very important aspect of behavioral interviewing. In failure stories, many people forget to talk about the results in the context of learnings. So many people tend to say, hey, to come back to an answer that I previously gave about my previous HR business, it failed in 5 years, and this is the result. It failed and it generated the loss of $2 million. And you are very tempted to talk about this as being the result, when in fact this is the end of the action. So in the results part, you talk about your learnings in a failure story, and you should ideally have at least 3 of them if you want some advice here. The fifth common mistake that people do while answering behavioral questions is related to how they answer those questions, that is, hypothetical answers versus specific ones. And for example, if you'd ask me how do you make trade-offs between quality and costs, I could say, yes, this is a very interesting question, and whenever I would have to make trade-offs between quality and costs, I always prioritize quality. And I've been doing this throughout my career, and it's been very, very successful. I've always had great successes in my projects. So this is the classic example of a hypothetical answer that you cannot quantify, and it doesn't make much sense. Instead, you should talk about the specific scenario where you applied this rationing. Now, there is, however, one very important note here, that in the case that you are being asked a question, a behavioral question, you don't have an immediate answer for it, one trick is to actually start a hypothetical answer, like I did before. So whenever I have to make trade-offs between quality and cost, I do this and that. And the specific example would be when I did this and that, right? So you would intentionally talk about the situation, the hypothetical situation in this case, for a longer period of time to win time to remember about a specific situation that would best fit the question that you're asked. Number 6 here would be, some people tend to answer non-behavioral questions in a behavioral way, such as tell me about yourself. There's not much sense in applying this star approach in tell me about yourself or why do you want to work here. Although, you know, on smaller segments, for example, in tell me about yourself, you could talk about some of your highlights in your career, and you could use the star format if you wanted to, but that would have to be a very compressed star format, such as I was tasked to do this, which I did like this, and the result was this in 1 or 2 sentences. But usually you should only use the star format while being asked a behavioral question, like one that's asking about your past experience in order to predict your future performance on the job. Number 7 here would be, too many people forget to talk about quantifiable information in their answers, such as, you know, when you say, hey, and it turned out to be a success. Okay, but how do you know it was a success? What's the best metric to quantify that success? Now, there's also the other extreme that some people tend to use too many metrics, too many non-important, irrelevant metrics. Like I said in the beginning, you tend to develop too much on the situation and task on the non-essential part. So you should include quantifiable information so long as those metrics are the most relevant to make your interviewer understand your story properly. Number 8 here would be negativity, and this is a very important one, and this is a more advanced type of feedback, but a very important one. To give you an example here, can you tell me about the time when you refused to compromise on your standards? And I actually heard this answer recently. So for a grocery store manager, he used to evaluate vendors that would deliver sandwiches to their store, and in one case that vendor was delivering a insufficient level of quality in their sandwiches, and I actually refused to certify that vendor and inform my manager that, hey, it's not a good idea, that we should go with them. However, my manager actually did not agree with me, but he learned this the hard way 3 months later. So this is one time when I refused to compromise on my standards. Now, notice here, you know, the non-essential part of saying, I told this to my manager, but he didn't believe me. Like, there's no point in introducing that extra element of negativity and furthermore talking about he said, she said type of things, and not necessarily putting the blame on others, but negativity. So negativity is something you want to be very, very careful. And another scenario of negativity would be in failure story when you talk about the results. Like some people tend to still focus on the failure even in the results. Like, I failed, it was so bad, so I felt miserable, and I'm sorry for this failure. Like, this is not at all how you want to end an answer. You should always try to end an answer on a strong note, on a positive note, and always try to sell yourself on your strengths ultimately. So keep in mind, negativity is a very important thing to keep in mind here. Number 9, it's actually one that I previously touched upon, but because it's so important, I thought it'd be very important, very relevant to mention it once more: the clarity of thought. So many people have great stories, but they cannot really communicate those stories. So clarity of thought is something that is, especially for people applying in AWS, it's a huge topic. So it's as simple as this: like, can you understand what you're saying from the first shot? Does it feel like it's the right thing that you're communicating? If so, then fine. If not, then it's simply not good enough. So clarity of thought is something that probably the main reason why I recommend role-playing behavioral questions. I mean, role play to be the most efficient way to tune up your behavioral interviewing skills. But clarity of thought is something wildly underrated, and probably the second most important problem after the quality of your story. And my final piece of advice here is once you ensure that you have a quality story, and once you ensure that you are communicating it properly in a way that everyone understands you, and once you have a proper star format, and once you have your information quantifiable, you should ideally try to keep your answers within 1.5 to 2 minutes. This is advice that makes particular sense to people applying for senior roles. So it's not uncommon for the interviewer to hurry you to say, hey, okay, can you get to the point? Simply because you're taking too long to communicate your idea. However, you should keep in mind this is not necessarily negative feedback that you're receiving. They are simply trying to hurry up so they can also complete their job, right? Because they have a job after all, they have to screen you. So you're doing your best to communicate your best possible stories, and they are doing their best to screen you in the best possible way. So that's why they sometimes might hurry up. But this is by no means an indication that you're going to fail the interview by receiving these types of feedback. But keep in mind, the 1.5 to 2 minutes is where you ideally want to be. So there you go. These were my 10 pieces of advice. Also, please keep in mind that the best way to support this channel is to share your interview experience in the comment sections of the videos. And thank you very much for watching.